Okay, welcome back. In the next set of videos, what we're going to do is we're going to tackle an actual production project so you can see how to use the Hypershade in a real life circumstance. So let's go ahead and open up this example scene so we can get started. I'll hit Control-O to open up the scene browser here, and the scene that I want to go ahead and open up is called Desert Start. So I'll go ahead and open that up. Okay, so this is what we have. If I hit 5 on the keyboard to go to shaded view, I can go ahead and see that I have myself a pretty simple scene here, but it's going to show us a bunch of different techniques that we can use to go ahead and shade this scene. So we can see that we have here some objects, basically some wooden posts here of some old rundown fence that used to be here a long time ago, and this is pretty much all there is left. We have some terrain here, a little bit bumpy, rocky type terrain. And then we have some rocks here, some large stones, as well as some small pebbles, if you will. And then over here in the middle we have this sort of bent up old decrepit tin can that's been left here for who knows how many years. And over here of course we have some lights. So we've got a light rig already set up. So basically here's the situation we have. Let's pretend here like we are working on a team here. Modelers already created this scene, the geometry, and the lighting artist already set up the lighting for the scene. If I go ahead and hit the render button up here and do a quick render here to see what we have, this is what we have. It's a pretty small render right now. Let me resize this window here, and I'm also going to go up to options. I'm going to go to test resolution and make sure that I have render settings turned on, which is 640 by 480. Right now I had the preview 50% setting turned on, which is only 320 by 240. So I want to go back and do a full render settings preview here. And I'll hit render again. So this time we can have a nice large render at 640 by 480 pixels. So this is what we have. There's a background here, the mental ray sky shader in the background, and then we have our nice lighting rig here that's producing some indirect, fake indirect illumination here, as well as some direct illumination coming from a sort of sun that's at an angle there where it looks like it's sunset, or maybe it's sunrise. Could be either or. So we'll just pretend it's sunset. Okay. So the objects don't have any materials. Right now the objects are all using the default Lambert shader. If I go ahead and open up the hotbox here and go to Window, go to Rendering Editors, and go to the Hypershade, I can see that in the Hypershade I only have one material here, and that's this Lambert 1. And that Lambert 1 right now is being used by all the objects in the scene, which is pretty much the default behavior in Maya whenever you create a brand new scene. The Lambert 1 shader is applied to every piece of geometry in your scene by default. Okay, so what's our job? What's the challenge here? Our job is to take these objects and apply materials and create custom shader networks and graphs so that these materials look the way they're supposed to. So the wooden posts will look like wooden posts. So these large stones and rocks will look like stones and rocky materials. And so that the ground has a nice ground texture, perhaps some dirt or sand, and make it look nice and dirty, something like that. And of course that tin can, we have to give it sort of old rusted texture or old rusted looking material so it looks convincing, like an old can that was just left there and, by who knows who sometime in the past, maybe years ago. Somebody just dropped that can there. Okay, so that's the challenge here, and that's what we're going to do in the next set of videos. We're going to do that. So we have a lot to cover here, so let's just go ahead and jump in and get started. And I'm going to go through all the process and steps here, and you can follow along or you can just watch me do it, and you're going to learn a lot of neat little tricks and tips here for getting this done. Okay, so let's start off with the rock here. We know that we need a rock sort of texture for this rock, so let's go ahead and let's go ahead and start doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply Lambert shader to this rock, and that's going to be pretty easy to do. All I have to do is right click and hold down the right mouse button on the rock, go down to Assign New Material, and in the Assign New Material menu I'm going to go all the way up to where it says Lambert, and I'm going to let go of the mouse button on top of Lambert, and that'll open up the attribute editor and let us know that a Lambert shader has been applied to that rock. And if I change the color here in the Lambert 2 shader to say green, and I were to render this out again, you'll notice that the rock turned green. So now it's got that green Lambert. So we know it's got the green Lambert for sure. Now we don't want the Lambert to be a green color. That's not going to work out too well. Okay, so what we need to do is apply a texture of rock, a rock sort of material. Now textures, where can you get textures? Well, there's lots of websites where you can buy textures, some websites where you can get textures for free. You can also take images with a high resolution camera. I strongly suggest going with a camera that has the highest megapixel rating that you can possibly get. Something like 7 megapixels at least or higher is going to work out really good, because the higher res a texture is, or the higher res an image is, the better it's going to look. You can also use image editing programs like Adobe Photoshop, which is probably the most infamous, most famous Photoshop or image editing program out there. There's also other programs like Corel Painter is a pretty good one. And if you don't want to go ahead or you don't have the budget to purchase any of those, you can always go ahead and get a piece of software called the GIMP, which is an open source image editing program that works on Linux as well as Windows. So you can get that and use that completely for free, even for commercial purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to plug in a color image that I created already for this rock in the color channel. That's where we want to place our color image. So I'll click on this little checkerboard icon here. That's going to open up this Create Render Node window, and we can see we have different tabs. A tab for mental ray, utilities, lights, textures, and materials. Well, we don't want to plug in a light to the color of the rock. That wouldn't make any sense. And we don't want to use any of these utilities, although we could, but that's not what we're after. What we're going to do is go to textures here, and in textures we can apply a bunch of different textures. We have 2 different categories for textures here, 2 main categories, which is 2D textures, which are images, 2-dimensional textures, and then down here we have 3D textures. These are 3D procedural textures. Procedural meaning that they're created by Maya on the fly. Okay, they're not images that come in from another program. They're not pictures that you took with your camera. These are actually created by the system. Okay. Now we do have some procedural wood textures here in a marble, granite, crater, cloud brownie, and stuff like that. Even this rock one here. But we don't want to use that. Okay. What we're going to do is go up to File up here. Click on this button here. It says File. That's going to open up this attribute editor here. Going to go to this window here where we have a file node as well as a place 2D texture node. We're not going to concern ourselves at this moment with the place 2D texture node. We're going to go to the file node, and we can see here we have a few options. Now the main option here is the image name field. Right here is where you're going to plug in and load up an image from the hard drive. So we're going to click on this little folder icon right here on the right. That's going to open up a file browser here, and in the file browser you should be taken automatically to the source images directory of the project directory. Okay, that's why it's very important to load up a project and to work in a proper project directory system, which Maya allows you to do. Now in the first video of this tutorial we actually went ahead and assigned the default or the current project to be the project folder that comes with this tutorial, and the reason we did that was so that we can open up these scenes with no problem, and so we can go ahead and get these textures that I have already created for us to use in this tutorial. Alright, so Maya's going to go ahead and it's going to look in the project directory, which in this case is i3 Tutorials Intro Hypershade. If you remember from the first video, that's the project we loaded up. And in that project is a folder for source images. And this is where Maya's going to look for all these textures by default. Now you can see here that I have a lot of... So we can see that we have a lot of different texture images here. And they're all pretty much JPEGs with a couple of exceptions, but we'll see that later. So we're mainly using JPEGs here because they're pretty decent quality and the file size is relatively small. Okay, so we want to apply a rock texture to this. I have already some rock textures set up for this. We have a rock color map here. We also have a bump map. I'll talk about bump maps in a moment. And we're going to use the rock color right now. So we'll go ahead and select the rock color and hit open. And you can see it here in the texture sample slot up here. If it doesn't refresh, all you have to do is left click once right there on that color swatch and it'll refresh for you. And that should do it. Now if we go ahead and we do a render again, the rock's not going to be green anymore. Now you're going to have this rock texture on the rock. Okay, so fantastic. So now it looks more like a rock. But it still doesn't look that great, and I'm going to be very picky. It can look a whole lot better. Okay, so let me go over some quick things here. You notice that there's this filter type attribute up here that says quadratic. This is the default filter. Okay, Maya by default applies a filter to your textures, and the filter is designed to do a couple of things. One thing it's designed to do is kind of blur the texture out a little bit so it's not too grainy looking, which could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on what you're trying to do. The other thing it does is that filters can actually increase or decrease the render time by a few seconds, depending on the filter and also depending on your texture. Okay, so let's go ahead and click on this drop down box here so we can see the different options for filters. We have a lot of different filters we can use. We can use a bitmap, a box, a quadratic, which is the default, a quartic, and a Gaussian here. We can also just turn the filter off. So the current render shows a filter, a quadratic filter, which is the default. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a render region here, and then I'm going to save this image out. So I'm going to click on this little box up here to keep the image, and then I'm going to click on this icon over here with the red little rectangle there to do a render region of just that area. And if we go ahead and go to the before image, this is the before. Just use this little scroller down here to move to the before and the after. The before one is the one on the right, and then the after one is the one on the left. It may be a little bit hard to see in the video, but if you're looking at it, if you're following this tutorial and you're rendering and doing exactly what I'm doing, you'll notice that there's a huge difference. With the filter on, the texture actually looks kind of blurry, looks a little bit more indistinct. If you look at the image on the left, the texture looks sharper and looks more detailed. Okay, so what's the difference between the two? Well, the difference is that the filter tries to blur out the texture a bit. Taking a filter off can actually give you a much better result. Sometimes it can actually increase render times, but it really depends on the scene. It really is dependent on the type of scene that you're doing and the type of textures that you're using. In this case, looks like taking the filter off works out pretty well. We can also switch filters. Now, when I'm using color maps, I hate using the quadratic filter by default. I like to switch over to either no filter, or sometimes I'll use a bitmap filter, depending on how my render times are being impacted, and also depending on how my image, how my render is looking. Sometimes using a bitmap filter can actually be pretty good. So I'm going to save this image out here, which was with no filter. I'm going to do another render region, this time with the bitmap filter. Okay, so here's the bitmap filter, and here's the quadratic. Not too much of a difference, but there is a difference in render time. It's a little bit difficult to see down here, so I'll zoom out a little bit, and I'm just using the mouse scroll wheel to do that. Over here I can zoom in and out. Okay, so we can see here the render time down here is 3 seconds with a bitmap filter, and if I go back to quadratic filter, it's 4 seconds. So the quality looks virtually the same, but I actually saved myself some render time by using the bitmap filter. So you can see that using a bitmap filter is actually good because it gives you the same quality as the quadratic filter, but it can render out a lot faster than the quadratic filter, which is obviously a good boost, a good thing to have. Okay, or you can just take the filter off completely and just get yourself a render out of the texture without any filter. In my case, I think what I'm going to do is leave the filter off because it actually looks pretty good. So I'm going to take the filter off. I like it without the filter. I think it looked nicer without the filter, and it's still rendered in the same amount of time as the bitmap filter. So I'm going to leave that filter off. And again, filters are something that are overlooked a lot when people work in Maya or in 3D programs in general, but a filter can really drastically make a huge difference on your textures. So sometimes you'll work on high-res textures and you'll wonder, why in the world do my textures not look crisp when I render them out in Maya? Well, that's usually the case because of the filter type. And again, it's something that's overlooked by a lot of 3D artists when working in Maya or other 3D software. Okay, so now that we already set that up, I'm going to close that. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something a little bit different to add some detail to this. So let me come in here. I'm going to click on this little camera icon to do a snapshot. And I'm going to do render region in this area. I'm going to right click on this little the right button here with the little box and an arrow coming out, which is the remove image button. I'm going to hold down the right mouse button and I'm going to click on remove all images. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do render region here. Okay, so here's the rock with just a color map and no bump map or anything like that. It's just a color map with no filter. I'm going to save this image, okay, because I'm going to do a little bit of comparing and contrasting here. I'm going to go ahead and take the rock here. I'm going to hold down the right mouse button to go to the right click menu, and I'm going to go to material attributes. That'll open up an attribute editor here, straight to the material. Okay. Now, if you notice down here, we have a bump mapping slot right there. Okay. You'll notice that there's nothing there right now. So I want to click on the checkerboard icon, and I want to plug in a file. So I'll click on File, and then this will open up the attribute editor for the bump nodes, the file node, as well as the bump 2D node. Okay. The bump 2D node controls the amount of bump, while the file node controls the actual file from the hard drive that you're going to use as the bump map. So very quickly, what is a bump map? A bump map allows you to add more detail to an object by creating a sort of optical illusion using the normals to sort of give more depth to the object. So you can take a piece of concrete or a rock like this, for example, and make those holes really pop out and look more convincing, realistic, because the lighting in the scene is going to interact with that bump map. And even though the bump map isn't actually adding any real physical details, the geometry of the object is not changing, this effect is great for doing little details. It's not good for doing big details, however. So if you're doing, say, a door with a doorknob, you don't want to make a doorknob out of a bump map. It'll never work. You have to create the doorknob out of physical geometry, 3D geometry. But if you're trying to do a small detail, like let's say the small grooves on the surface of a piece of wood, that's something that you would want to do with a bump map. You don't want to waste your time modeling that with, say, something like ZBrush or Mudbox, although you could, but a bump map will actually work just as good, if not better, and it's more efficient, okay? So what we're going to do is plug in a bump map. Now, what we need to do is plug in the bump map here, so we'll click on the folder icon. Again, this takes us to the source images project directory, and this time we want rock bump. So we'll go ahead and double click on that to open that up. Okay, so now we have the rock bump. Now with the default settings, if I go back to the bump 2D node over here, the default setting is 1, which is actually too high, but just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and render this out, do a little render region right there. And I saved the previous render out, so that's what we have. You can see the rock looks very, very bumpy, no pun intended, and we can see that there's a lot more detail in the rock and the way that the lighting interacts with the surface of the rock. Now the rock looks like it changed in the render, but in the viewport it actually didn't change. If I minimize that attribute editor and the render view window, you notice in the viewport it looks exactly the same. It hasn't changed at all. Okay? We go back to the Lambert shader here in the attribute editor, and down here in the bump mapping I'll click on this little icon here that shows an input. Okay, so now we're back here to the to this node here, and let me go ahead and bring back the render view window. Alright, but this is too much bump. Right now the bump effect is way too strong, and you don't want the effect to be way too strong because it can make your textures and your objects look pretty bad. So just a quick compare and contrast. Here's the before and here's the after. What we want to do is change this after and get a better balance here, a little bit less bump. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, you'll notice that we don't have the bump node here anymore, so I'll go down here and I'll click on this button right here, okay, to go to the output, and that'll take me back to the bump 2D node. Now the default setting is 1. We don't want to go with a default setting of 1. We want to actually lower that a little bit. So what we're going to lower it to is about half. We're going to go to 0.5. That's going to give us a much better result. So we'll go ahead and do a render region there to see what we get. Okay, so that's what we have. And this looks a lot better. And if we look at the before, here's no bump map, and here we have a bump map. The lighting on the rock looks a lot better, and you can see more details of the rock. It almost looks like you can reach in there and scratch that surface of the rock with your fingernails, and it would feel like an actual rock of that type. So bump maps are very important for making your objects look a little bit more detailed and adding more depth to the object, without actually going in there and modeling all this detail yourself, which would create a very, very high-res model of millions and millions of polygons, which we don't really need. Okay? And it still renders just as fast. If you look down here in the time, it's 3 seconds. So the before was 3 seconds, the after is 3 seconds, but the difference is that the before doesn't look very good and the after looks a whole lot better. Now another important thing about bump maps, if we go to the file node over here in the attribute editor, you notice that by default again Maya gave us a quadratic filter. We don't want that. Whenever you use bump maps, I strongly recommend that you never ever use a filter at all. It's not a good idea to use a filter on a bump map. It's not practical because it'll kill the bump map effect. The last thing you want is a filter trying to blur out your bump map. Okay? So we'll just go ahead and leave the filter on off. And a bump map is just a grayscale image. If I go ahead and I click on view over here, it'll actually open up whatever program I have, in this case the default Windows picture viewer here. It'll open up the actual image here so you can actually see it outside of Maya. Okay, so we can see this is the bump map right here. It's basically a grayscale image. Now it doesn't have to be grayscale, it can actually be a color image, but it's more practical to make it a grayscale image, because the way that it works is areas that are darker and closer to black have less bump and are flat and smooth surfaces. Okay, areas that are closer to white and are lighter on the grayscale, and the closer an area is to the color white or a light gray, is an area that's going to be protruded, an area that's going to be higher on the grayscale here of the bump map. Okay, so this is what the bump map looks like on the texture. So you can see here we have some areas where it gets dark and then it gets lighter, and we have some mid grays, and that's determining the actual bump effect. So I'll close this. Alright, so make sure the filter's off over here for the bump map. Try never to use a filter on the bump map again. And I'll close that. And let's go ahead. I'm going to save this image out because this one has the filter. And I'm going to do another render region here of the bump map with the same setting as before, with the only difference being it's got no filter this time. So here it is with a filter, and here it is without a filter. As you can see, the bump mapping looks a whole lot better without the filter. With the filter, the bump mapping effect is kind of killed because the filter actually applies blurring to the bump map, which is not good. You don't want any blurring, because the more blurring you have, the less detailed your bump map's going to be, and that kind of defeats the purpose of spending time in an image editing program creating a nice bump map if you're just going to end up blurring it with a filter anyway. So you want to make sure that filter's on. So this looks great. Okay, so I'm going to right click up here, remove all images. Alright, awesome. Let me close that. Okay, so just to get moving along here quickly, what we're going to do is go ahead and apply the texture for the terrain. So we're going to select the terrain, then we're going to hold down the right mouse button and go down to assign new material, and we're going to assign a new material to this called a Lambert. So we're going to do a Lambert shader again, because we don't want any shininess to this. It's not a piece of plastic or glass, so Lambert's going to work just fine. And in this new Lambert shader, we'll go to the color swatch here, and we'll plug in a file. And the file that we're going to go ahead and look for is going to be called ground color, which is right up here, ground_color. I'm going to load that up. It's a very large image, 4,000 pixels by 4,000, and we have a quadratic filter right now. I'm going to go ahead and switch that to a bitmap filter, which in my opinion looks a lot better and works a lot nicer too. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're also going to do a little something here to the place 2D texture node, but I'll show you that in a moment. And one more thing I'm going to do here with Maya that's can get kind of annoying sometimes. I'm going to go up here to these main menu options in the attribute editor, and under the list option I'm going to uncheck auto load selected attributes. And what that does is whenever I select a new object inside my viewport, my attribute editor won't switch automatically, which can be pretty annoying behavior when working on something like this. So by taking that off, you'll notice my attribute editor stays in place, doesn't move, jump around or anything like that, which is fantastic. Okay, so with this ground selected, we've already applied the texture to it. So let's go ahead and let's do a quick render region here, or a render I should say. Just do a full render. Okay, and there's the ground texture. Okay, now the ground texture doesn't look so great right now. So let's kind of analyze this and kind of try to figure out why the ground texture doesn't look very good right now. Okay, so one thing that we'll notice is that the scale of the ground texture doesn't look that great. In other words, the ground texture scale, the way these little rocks look in the image of the ground texture, looks kind of disproportional, looks kind of big, and doesn't look that great. You can tell it's a flat texture and it's not looking too nice. So what can we do to fix that? Well, there's a lot of stuff we can do to this to fix it. So we've just gotten started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to the Place 2D Texture node, which is this node here, and it always has this utility sample swatch here, which kind of has this strange icon up there. And we can do a few different things here. Okay, we can rotate the texture around by doing this. Let me go ahead and save the first image out, and I'll just do a render region right there, just so it's a little bit faster. And what happened was that the texture got rotated. You can see here's the before and here's the after. Before, after. Okay? What happened was that this rotate frame parameter rotates the texture around, but that's not what we want to do. So let's put that back down to 0. What we want to do is you want to repeat the texture, and we can repeat the texture over and over again by using this repeat UV parameter. So right now by default it's set to 1 and 1 for the U and V directions, which means that the texture is only going to be shown once. It's not going to repeat several times. Now let me show you what I'm talking about. If I go back to the file node over here and I click on view, this is what the texture looks like, okay? This is one repeat, okay? So this is what's happening now with our terrain. Well, we can have the texture repeat over and over again, almost like a checkerboard. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let me close that, and I'm going to go back to the Place 2D Texture node, and under Repeat UV, I'm going to type in 10 and 10. Okay, so now it's going to repeat 10 times. And I'm going to re-render the whole image here. And there it is. You can see that the texture, the detail of the texture looks a lot smaller now, and it's not scaled out of proportion like before. That's because we've shrunk the texture down by forcing it to repeat 10 times by 10 times. Because of that, it basically is making the texture tile or repeat 10 times in the same area that it was in before. Okay, so it causes it to look smaller. But that's a little bit too small. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go for a value of 4 and 4 for the repeat. I'm going to render that again, and we should get a good balance. Okay, so now we can see the detail a lot better, the little stones and rocks in the texture, and it doesn't look scaled out of proportion, which looks pretty good. Alright, awesome. So I'm going to click on this output connection button here to take me back to the Lambert shader. And now that I have the color in there, I'm going to apply Bumpmap because I do have a Bumpmap for this. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the Bumpmap node right there, plug in a file, and I'll go to it by clicking on this little input icon there. Usually goes to it by itself, but sometimes mine goes kind of crazy and doesn't do things that it's supposed to. And over here, we're going to load up an image, the ground bump map here. So we'll see ground bump. So we'll load that one up. And again, with bump maps, you don't want to have any filter. So we'll turn the filter off. And I'll click on this output button right here so I can go back to the bump node. And if you find that this is a little bit tricky because you have to use these buttons, the input and output buttons, an easier way to work with materials is using the Hypershade. So let's do that. I'll go ahead and open up the Hypershade with the hotbox. And here's the Hypershade. Here we can see all of our materials that we've created. I believe this is the rock material, this is ground material. And a good idea would be to start renaming these material nodes so they make more sense, so you can pick them out easier and faster as opposed to looking at them and going, well, what's Lambert 1, Lambert 2, and Lambert 3? Okay, so a quick way to graph this, what I'm going to do is in the viewport, I'm going to click and select the terrain, and then in the Hypershade, I'm going to click on this icon here that shows this little blue thing here with these two green squares. When I click on that, down in the work area, my shader graph is displayed. Okay, so I'm going to go over here where there's these three buttons. This one here with two black rectangles. Then we have one black rectangle on the bottom and one black rectangle on the top. We want to go on the one in the middle here to show the bottom area. Okay, when I do that, I can hit A on the keyboard to frame in on it all and kind of zoom in as much as possible, as much as my work area allows. So if I were to make this Hypershade window larger and I hit A, it'll zoom in even more. Okay, so there we go. This is a great way of seeing how all this stuff is working. Here's the shading engine or the shading group, which is attached to the object, in this case the terrain object in my viewport. Attached to the shading group is the Lambert shader we created, and attached to the Lambert shader is a color map as well as its Place 2D texture, which tells the color map how to be placed on the object. And also the bump map is connected to the Lambert shader. And the bump map has the bump material here, or the bump image from the hard drive. And the bump image is being controlled by the Place 2D texture node over here. Okay, so that's how it works. So it makes a lot of sense how this works. Everything is piped in together and is all being funneled right into this Lambert shading engine over here, this shading group over here called Lambert 3. Okay, so a good idea would be to rename some of this stuff. So I'm going to hold down the right mouse button over this shading group node, and I'm going to go down to rename, and I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call it ground, and I'm going to put underscore matte for material, and I'm going to put in SG at the end in capital letters, which stands for shading group. okay? Just to keep my naming convention going here. It's not really important to do that, but I like to do it. It's just the way that I organize things in my brain, so it helps me. You can do however you want, though. And over here, the Lambert shader, we could rename this if we want, but I'm not going to at the moment, okay? And I am going to go over to this File 3 node. I don't like the name File 3, so I'm going to right-click, go to Rename, and I'm going to call this Color, okay? I'm going to go down to this Bump node here, which is called File 4, and I'm going to rename that one as well. I'm going to just call it Bump. And I'm not going to bother renaming this Lambert 3 at the moment. It's not really that important. I'll rename it later when it makes more sense to do so. So now with the Hypershade open, we can actually work a little bit easier. The Hypershade gives you a nice visual way of seeing how all this stuff is plugged in together. Let me minimize the Hypershade for now. And again, if I go ahead and right click on the terrain, or I select it, right click on the terrain, and go to Material Attributes, I can navigate in and out of that graph from one node to the other. For example, here's the Shading Group node. This is the Lambert Shader node. If I click on this button here, I go to the Color node, and here's the Place 2D Texture. So this Place 2D Texture, if I open up the Hypershade, is this node right here, okay? If I go to the Color tab, this node here is the equivalent of going to this node here, this Color node, okay? And if I click on this Output Connection button down here, I end up going back to the Lambert Shader, which is the equivalent of going to this node here. So I think you start to get the idea of how that works. So it can be kind of confusing unless you have a lot of experience working with stuff like this in Maya. It can be kind of confusing with the input and output buttons here to go from one node to the other. So for someone who's learning about the Hypershade and surfacing and setting up materials in Maya, it might be actually better to work with the Hypershade this way, because with all these nodes in this graph, it makes a lot more sense visually, and your brain can wrap itself around this idea a lot easier and a lot faster. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do probably from now on, since it's much more simple to use and makes a lot more sense from a visual standpoint, and I am a visual person, so this helps me. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and double click on this Bump 2D node for the terrain. That way I can open up the attribute editor for that bump node, and I'm going to change the bump depth to something lower because right now 1, the default value, is too high. And let's go with something like 0.5 just to get us started here. I'm going to minimize the Hypershade, and I'm going to do a render region here just to see how this is starting to look with the bump map. And you can see the big difference here. This area outside the render region has no bump mapping. This is with bump mapping value of 0.5. That is too strong. That effect is just killing the terrain, and it looks horrible, really. So I'm not going to go with that. So I'm going to drop this down to about 0.1. I'm going to do another render region here. See what we end up with. Hopefully something a lot better. And a little bit better, a little bit of an improvement, but it still looks kind of crunchy, so to speak, for lack of a better description. I don't really like that. I want the bump effect to look a little bit more subtle. So let's go something like 0.01 and see what that gives us. So I'll render again. And that looks a little bit better, but you can barely tell that there's a bump effect going on. Let me raise that to about 0.02. And do another render region. Okay, that looks a little bit better, much better improvement than before, but I'm not too happy with that, and I think I know why that is. If I go to the bump node over here, I can see, well, I do have my filter turned off, so it still isn't looking the best that it can be. But that'll be improved in a moment anyway. Okay, so I'm going to say for the moment, I'm happy with that. I'm going to close that attribute editor. Okay, and now let's go ahead and let's render out the whole thing. Just render out the whole image here. And something that can really get past you that you could easily fail to catch, just going to expand this render view window up a little bit more, that way I can read my information down here easier, is the fact that if you change the scale of the color image, you should probably change the scale of the bump map as well, so it matches up with it. So things aren't looking that great right now because the bump map and the color map are not matching up correctly. So let's fix that. Let's go ahead and bring out that Hypershade again, because if I go to the Place 2D Texture node of the color map, you notice that my repeats are set to 4 and 4. But if I go to the same Place 2D Texture node of the Bumpmap, my repeats are set at 1 and 1, which is the default. So it can be very easy to overlook that. So I'm going to go ahead and put in 4 and 4, so it matches up with the color map. And we can see in the Hypershade it does match up. You can see right there the tiling of the texture in both the bump and color map. So I'll minimize that. And I'll save this image out for compare and contrast reasons. I'll render out a new one. And there we go. That looks a whole lot better than before. So here's the before. Ooh, very nasty. Here's the after. Nice, very nice. The bump effect is nice and subtle, the way that it should be. Looks very clear and crisp as well, because it is a high-res bump map, and it has no filter applied. So it's a nice subtle effect that adds a lot of depth to the render. Awesome, fantastic. I'm going to right-click here and remove all images. Perfect. Only 10 seconds to render that out, so we're doing pretty good. Okay, but I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, you know what? These materials, although they look pretty decent, can be drastically improved using a few cool production tricks and tips that we can use to make this look a lot better. So how can we make the ground look a lot better? Well, one thing that you'll notice, if you look over here where the rock and the ground meet up, there's no contact shadows right now. Okay? Now that probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but it will once I show you how this works. We can actually add something called ambient occlusion to this to make a nice contact shadow look here, to make our rocks, our terrain, and to make everything in our scene look a little bit grittier, a little bit dirtier, and a little bit nicer. So you can add a nice little touch. And that's what we're going to do next. But this video has run long enough, and I'm going to end it here. In the next video, we're going to look at how to create some more complex shader networks and build upon the shader network we have for the terrain. Okay, so we'll see that in the next video. I'll see you then.